We're going to talk now about a story we covered a bit on last week's show. This was the controversial decision to rewrite sections of some of Roald Dahl's children's books. Words such as fat and ugly were removed from the novels in an attempt to make them more suitable for modern audiences. The decision was condemned by a number of people, including Salman Rushdie, and at a literary event on Thursday, even the Queen Consort appeared to criticise the move. However, the book's publishers, Puffin UK, have since said they're going to republish the original versions of Dahl's books alongside the edited copies. So to discuss this latest development, we're joined now by the journalist and writer Ella Whelan. So, Ella, a lot of people will have seen some of the rewrites that were done to Roald Dahl's books and just look at them and think, these are not very good. What kind of arrogance does it take to think that you can better one of the best children's authors of all time?
The only kind of arrogance that exists in the publishing world. I mean, people forget how intensely elitist, intensely small-minded so much of the publishing industry is, and how sort of unliterary so many of them are. A lot of these changes felt like someone just did a kind of Control-F find for a certain word in the book. So, for example, the word black was deemed to be too offensive, and so the description of the BFG's cloak as black was removed. So, things that don't
that's
make
just insane.
It just doesn't make any sense, and it's incredibly cack-handed. But also, I was kind of reading, there was this great article, Response, by a woman who's a sort of body-positive campaigner who's fat and bold by her own description, and she pointed out that changing the word fat to enormous was much worse.
Yes, it is worse.
That, no one wants to be called enormous.
So even by their own standards, they're messing this up.
Yeah, but I think that story was interesting, but what's almost been even more interesting has been the fallout from it and the response to it. And actually, it makes you sort of value and respect the publishing industry even less, that they have sort of caved in a way, even though I don't want them to censor Roald Dahl. The fact that it's, it took the Queen Consort and Salman Rushdie, some very, important figures in a way, but that they can't even, they don't even have the courage of their own convictions for what they believe is right. So if they really thought it was the case that children reading the twits being described as ugly was so corrosive to children's state of mind that they have to remove it, then simply having a bit of a backlash shouldn't change that over the week. And yet they have now said they're going to republish it, very sorry, all that kind of thing. Well,
some people have argued that it was just a commercial decision, that what it is they don't want activists to come along and cause problems, like with the Dr. Seuss case, where, even the estate said, we're no longer going to sell these books anymore, and that they didn't want that to happen to such a cash cow like Roald Dahl.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about how undemocratic the publishing world is, again, because this wasn't something that had come out of an outcry from readers. It wasn't something that came from the Dahl family, from the Dahl estate. It was Puffin Books working with the group called Inclusive Voices or something like that, which is, you have these sort of these kind of grifters that come into institutions and say that they're going to sell them the peace of mind of not being caught out on Twitter or whatever for having uninclusive language in their books or in their institutions. And we see, you were just talking about Stonewall. It's a kind of like a literary version of Stonewall, in that it functions to kind of go through and blackline out all the things that could be misconstrued or could be deemed to be offensive.
Well, I saw an article in The Guardian, and inevitably they were defending the censorship, but they were sort of saying that, children these days, we've moved beyond saying things like fat and ugly. In other words, our worldview is the one that should be the only worldview. Isn't this the problem with the idea of sensitivity readers, full stop, that it's the imposition of one particular perception of the world onto everyone else?
They also have never been in a playground recently. Kids are incredibly dark and mean and nasty, and you would hope that they grow out of it eventually.
Yes.
But actually, the reason why Roald Dahl is still so important and so influential to many young readers, and why they like the kind of, even things like Harry Potter isn't exactly comparable to Roald Dahl, but some of the darker elements in that, kids like it because things that are all sugar and spice and all things nice just bore them.
Yes.
And actually having, you know, evil aunts and, you know, giant peaches and all the stuff the crazy stuff that Dahl cooked up was a way of sort of inviting a genuine safe space when you're reading at home.
Yes.
Your imagination to run wild and to indulge in those kind of darker elements. And it's just, it's a complete misunderstanding of the way that kids develop in terms of their kind of journey of reading, in terms of their own way of seeing the world, to think that we need to protect them from these sort of, you know, the difficult things in life.
Yes.
And also the sort of the funny things in life, and that it isn't, you know, I don't know if they've ever spent time with kids. You know, they're incredibly unfiltered. They do laugh at fat people, and they do, you know, they do all these things.
They do.
Which is, you know, you teach them that it's maybe not right, but I mean, that's what kids do.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a problem, though? There's a kind of, to me, I think there's a fundamental problem here in terms of publishing. Isn't the publisher's job really to be sort of custodians of the art form and to consider the artistry of the people, to preserve it, in other words, not to use it as an opportunity for social engineering?
Well, it's the really important point is about artistic freedom and you know, artistic integrity. Actually, something that's just come out in the last 24 hours has been a recording between Roald Dahl and Francis Bacon in an interview they did at Dahl's home, where they, you know, were pondering on this question of what will happen to our work after we die. And Dahl said, "I'll set my enormous crocodile on any publisher that dares ever touch even a comma in one of my pieces of work."
Well,
so,
there we are.
Well, you know, perhaps he sort of could foresee what was going to happen in the future. But there is a sort of a real sense of injustice.
Yes.
That if you are an artist, whether you're writing a book, writing a song, writing a play, doing a paint, you know, creating any kind of piece of art, there is a real intent going into that. Roald Dahl wasn't just kind of, you know, writing off anything and sending it in. This was something that he worked on. Each word was chosen. And, you know, us as readers and reading to our kids, you know, we are able to, you know, talk about complex things. Like, for example, Dahl himself, not the nicest man in the world, you know, had some fairly hairy views on Jewish people, for example. You know, there are lots of, you know, when kids get older and they come across different paintings, different, you know, theories from philosophers, you can get them to understand that, you know, 1973 was different to 1993 was different to 2023.
Yes, yes.
And we don't have to rewrite the whole of history to conform to our modern sensibilities.
Well, also, it assumes that we've got it all right, that we are correct. We're the first generation ever to be morally pure, which absolutely cannot be the case.
No, it can't be the case. And also, there is sort of, in terms of what this means for rearing kids, there is a real problem, I think, with trying to, you know, what Puffin Books was trying to do, which was protect readers. And we had it, I remember I was on last time on your show, we were talking about Fairy Tale of New York and how it was being censored to protect younger listeners who are more sensitive.
Yes.
There's this real sense in which we think the best way to raise the next generation is to protect them from everything real and everything negative, and so that their life experience should be just happiness after happiness after happiness. And that's a way to create psychos, because you can't, that isn't real, and it also means that the minute you come into any form of adversity, you're either going to kill someone or crumble. So it's quite worrying.
Well, that is worrying. But also, like, just in terms of the practice of sensitivity reading, I know this sort of originated within young people's fiction and children's work, but actually it's crept out. You know, we've had, like, the poet Kate Blanchett, she had a sensitivity reader say that she couldn't describe the landscape. I think she described it as a kind of deformity in the landscape. It's a poetic idea, a metaphor, and they think, well, that's ableist. I mean, that's how simplistic. These aren't artists, is what I'm saying.
No, and it also can be extremely ridiculous. I mean, I remember, actually, the film adaptation of The Witches, which I think came out in 2020, which didn't conform to Dahl's. Dahl said that the witches should have claw-like fingers, and in the film they decided to have Anne Hathaway have 3 fingers.
Yes.
And she was this evil character. She had to then apologise because I can't remember the name of it, Different Limb Society or something, came out and said that this was a terrible thing because, you know, limb deformity was not something to be associated with evil, and, you know, it's just,
right,
you know,
okay.
it's
so
endless.
Stupid.
I remember the Peter Rabbit film, which, you know, film explicitly for children, was attacked by the Allergy Society because there was a scene in that in which Peter Rabbit is pelted with blueberries, or someone is pelted with blueberries. He's allergic to blueberries. What a terrible thing to do. You know, it's just, it makes you want to, you know, kill yourself, because you just think, what is it about you know, I used the word grifters before, but what is it about this sort of current moment in which all people want to do is complain?
Yeah,
but really feels depressing.
There seem to be two tracks to it, aren't there? On the one hand, they go after authors who have problematic lives and have said problematic things, and therefore we shouldn't read them anymore. But now it's spread into what characters, what fictional characters say. I mean, I have a friend who's a novelist who's had to leave his publisher because they kept saying, well, your serial killer character says some very problematic things. I'm like, yeah, because he's a serial killer.
Yeah.
He's not nice. Why don't they understand the basics of artistic representation?
Well, I think it's maybe because we've given up on the idea of, or at least in the publishing world, they've given up on the idea of resilient readers,
right.
which is, or intellectually complex readers, and I mean that also among young adult readers and children.
Yes.
Which is that there is an ability to, you know, when you take a book that's a fictional work, you know that your imagination is being engaged, you know that this isn't the real world, and you hope actually that it isn't the real world, because most of the time we pick up a book to try and enter into a different realm.
Yes.
And I think that, you know, publishers too much now want to represent the world of Twitter or the world of sort of contemporary political debate, and actually they don't want to be inventive anymore. And I think that's a real shame, because there are lots of writers out there who still are pushing at the boundaries, who should be given a chance.
Ella Whelan, thanks very much for joining me.